Hi, this is your friend and your brother, Pastor Emmanuel Chodako. In this episode, we are going to talk about the history of the prophetic, And I'm going to share with you just some of the few things, how the prophetic began, and the essence, the main goal that God had in mind to bring the prophetic institution. First of all, I want us to understand that, number one, the prophetic began as part of God's covenant and then laws for the people of Israel. God's prophetic life way is based on the covenant he had with the people of Israel. You know that God made his first promises to Abraham in Genesis chapter 12, but then after the promises, he entered into deep covenant with Abraham in Genesis chapter 15. And as part of the covenant, God promised Abraham and his descendants that they were going to possess a lot of lands, talking about the Canaanites, the many other lands that God talked about. And then God promised that his descendants were going to be many descendants that will be like the sun on the seashore and the stars in the sky. After all these promises and covenants God entered into, God also, started working on Abraham, bringing Abraham to close fellowship with him. There were people we call the patriarchs that God started using them so that they could become representatives of God on the earth. So we talk about people like Abraham, Isaac, his son, Jacob, and his 12 sons, and their daughter. All these people, God started using them. But the thing is that God could decided to choose certain particular people who would become the means he was going to use to make known his will for mankind. And God started this by choosing the patriarchs. However, in the course of duty, God now started choosing some particular people and then using them as the main conduits of his divine messages or communications. So this is what God now started calling people into the office of prophets and started speaking, making known his will and plans for them, so that by these people he will be able to communicate his perfect will to humanity or the people of Israel, and as a result they will also be in position to live by the standards of God according to the plans God has for them. You understand me? So that is how the whole thing began. Now, to do this, God started with Abraham. And this is why Abraham was the first person God called a prophet. Before that, God has spoken with and to many people. But then the first person God called prophet himself was Abraham in Genesis chapter 20. And this was in line with when Abimelech, the king of the land, wanted to have Sarah for himself. Unfortunately, Sarah was a sister. At the same time, he was the wife of Abraham. And because of that, he did not have access to Abraham's wife. And this is why God appeared to Abimelech and said, return this man's wife to him. Why? Because he's a prophet. And even now, the wombs of the women have been shut, and you are all dead if you don't return the man's wife to him. But when you do, he will pray for you and you'll be healed. So God called Abraham a prophet. Now, so there is what we call the law of first mention. Anytime something begins first in the scriptures, we need to understand the context in which that thing happened and understand the rules that governed it. So let's pick Abraham, the first man called prophet. If you look at Abraham, even though God started speaking to people, but when we talk about prophets, as in the prophetic, Abraham began because he was the first to be called a prophet. Now, Abraham was a friend of God. He was a partner of God. Abraham represented God on the earth, and God had a deep, close relationship with him. He was in good intimacy with God. He heard God's voice and God spoke to him. And God used Abraham to speak to Abimelech, even though it was an indirect way of speaking to Abimelech. But the point is that Abraham was used by God to declare God's word even to Abimelech. So this is how the prophetic began. God uses people. And the second person the Bible called prophet, or God spoke to as prophet, was Prophet Moses. Moses was the next person addressed as prophet in scriptures. And we know what Moses did. Moses was used by the Lord to bring deliverance to the people of Israel. And God appointed him to lead his people to the promised land as part of the covenant he had with his people. And Moses, as a prophet, was used by God to receive laws from God and deliver these laws to the Israelites. So the prophet Moses started teaching the Israelites the laws of God, telling them what to do and what not to do. And Moses became the main man who was actually making known the true will of God to the people. So prophets are supposed to be teachers of the law, telling the people the actual things that God expects us and how we ought to live and things like that. So the prophetic actually began from the covenants and the promises God made with Abraham, and it gradually led to God appointing a man called a prophet, Moses. And after Moses, the other people that were addressed as prophets were Miriam, who was a sister to Moses and Aaron, and Deborah, who became a judge and a prophet. And God used Deborah to even judge the people of Israel and making known the intents and the plans of God for their lives. And after Miriam and Deborah, the other people that God used to called a prophet was Prophet Samuel. God called Samuel right from childhood, and God used Samuel in a very special way. God spoke to him, called him. He heard the voice of God, and none of his words fell to the ground because everybody knew that God had established Samuel as a prophet. Do you understand where I'm coming from? So you see, the whole thing about the history of the prophetic began from the people of Israel and the covenant God had with the patriarchs, and God's desire to ensure that they understand the covenant. For God was ready to fulfill his part of the covenant, but God wanted the people of Israel to be taught, to understand and know their responsibilities in fulfillment of the covenant he had with the Israelites. By so doing, he raised prophets who were going to be used to speak and teach the people of Israel. I believe that as we all know, after Samuel, there were many people like Elijah, Elisha, Gad, Nathan, and the rest that God used mightily to speak in their generation to issues and declare the will of God. But this is the journey of the whole prophetic, how it began, how it started. I believe that these few things I've shared will go a long way to bless you and bless your generation. The Lord bless you and the Lord keep you. My name again is Pastor Emmanuel Ochre Dakom. In the next episode, we are going to talk about the purpose of the prophetic. God bless you. Bye.